Shadow Slave. By Guiltythree. Chapter 1265, Dirty Job. Sonny had to spend a few moments calming down his wildly beating heart. Then, he looked around once again. The situation was much better than he had expected it to be. He really had not considered that the grotesque tunnel left behind by the Azure Serpent would be only partially drowned. Slicing through the flesh of a great monster was no easy task, and doing so underwater would have been even harder. More than that, he was less restricted in the use of Shadow Step now. But, most importantly, he could summon the covetous coffer. Opening the alloy chest underwater would have just resulted in the spatial storage being instantly filled with water. Now that they stood on a solid surface, things were different. Of course, the tunnel could be flooded at any moment, so they had to hurry. Sonny looked at Nephi's and flashed her a smile. Let's be quick. The sparks of light swirled around them, manifesting into memories. Neph's flame was replaced by a luminous paper lantern, and a sizable alloy chest appeared on the porous pink surface of the great monster's bone. A moment later, their weapons manifested. Am I reduced to a mere butcher's cleaver? Ah. Such humiliation. Sonny almost yelped when a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. The Sin of Solace looked somberly at his disheveled appearance, then shook his head. He was still clad in the shroud of graceless dusk, not to mention perfectly dry. Damn fool. Sonny whispered a stifled curse and commanded the shadows to wrap themselves around the jade blade of the cursed sword, which Sonny whispered a stifled curse and commanded the shadows to wrap themselves around the jade blade of the cursed sword, which had manifested itself a split second before. Then, he hissed, "Gods, you almost gave me a heart attack." Nephi's froze for a moment and looked at him with a slightly startled expression. Oh. Did I? Sorry. Sonny's eyes widened. No, not you. I wasn't talking. Ah, never mind. The Sin of Solace observed him with a small, disdainful smile. I must say. This is a peculiar location for a date. Harvesting monster meat from inside the monster. I hope you won't force the poor girl to cook the meal herself, at least. Struggling to ignore the bastard, Sonny threw the lid of the covetous coffer open and then moved closer to the wall of the flesh tunnel. Pushing down the feeling of disgust, he gritted his teeth and thrust the gem forward. It was so strange. The taste of the black turtle's meat was truly sublime. But the source of it was so revolting. Damn it. One of the enchantments of the Sin of Solace made it incredibly sharp, and it had been augmented by the shadows on top of that. And yet, cutting into the flesh of the dead great monster felt like he was trying to cut stone with a rusty blade. Sonny had known that harvesting the turtle's meat would not be easy, just from the fact that chewing it was a tough task. However, the actual difficulty of trying to slice off a sizable chunk of the abomination's flesh was even greater than he had expected. Its durability in an uncooked state was simply preposterous. If that's hard, then how am I going to fight one of these things in the future? With no other choice, Sonny concentrated on the task. Taut muscles rolled under his skin as he put all his strength into it, and the jade blade cut deeper with excruciating slowness. Nephi's was just as strained, using a sharp dagger instead of her long sword. Its blade was glowing with incandescent light, and her face was pale. Despite that, her progress was not much faster than his. The dark island continued to sway and quake around them, making the water filling the morbid tunnel roll and slosh. Carving the meat was hard, and doing it while struggling to keep balance was especially hard. Nevertheless, they continued, sometimes using each other for support. This is taking too long. Sonny had hoped to fill the covetous coffer to the brim, but now he realized how unrealistic his lofty desires were. At this rate, it would be good if they managed to harvest enough to feed them for a few days. Of course, as long as the battle between the Azure Serpent and the eerie butterfly did not end or shift in their direction, there was still time. And just as he threw the first chunk of meat into the maw of the alloy chest, the carcass of the black turtle quaked again. This time, however, there was something different about the tremor. Instead of being pushed to the side, Sonny had almost been thrown up into the air. Nephi's and he abruptly stopped, looking at each other. Sonny's mouth was suddenly very dry. They are below us now. The whole plan was hinged on the fact that the massive bulk of the black turtle would protect them from the two battling abominations. Now, the area of the battle was shifting, and the creatures were already below the dark island. This meant that they were moving in the direction of the turtle's head. Neff's eyes shone in the gloomy darkness as they reflected the glow of her scorching dagger. She lingered for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Sunny paused for a bit, then gritted his teeth. "We've already taken the risk. Returning with empty hands would mean that it was all for nothing. We'll have to wait for a chance to do it all over again, and even if such a chance presents itself, we'll be much weaker by then. So, let's continue. I can pull us back through the shadows, anyway." Nephi's nodded in agreement, prompting them to return to the arduous task of carving the turtle's flesh. Both of them were much more tense now. A few more slabs of meat fell into the covetous coffer, and at the same time, the shockwaves traveling through the island showed that the battling abominations were drawing closer to the creature's head. Eventually, Sunny lowered his bloodied hands and grimaced. "That's enough. It is too dangerous now." Closing the lid of the alloy chest, he dismissed it and froze for a moment, concentrating his perception on the haughty shadow. He had left it with Saint and Nightmare, so it had a good view of the turbulent waters surrounding the black turtle's head. The water had been turbulent before, but now, it was simply boiling. Bloody foam was undulating like a stormy sea, and two enormous shadows could be seen far below, intertwined with each other. They were just under the entrance to the gaping wound at the base of the titanic turtle's neck. Time to go. Grabbing Neff's hand, Sunny pulled the two of them into the shadow. But nothing happened. The shadows remained ethereal and elusive, as if he had never possessed the ability to dive into their dark embrace. Sunny froze, then slowly looked down. He was still standing on the slippery pink bone. Shadow Step had failed to activate. Chapter 1266, Unexpected Complication. What's wrong? What's wrong? Two identical questions sounded at the same time, but they couldn't be more different. Neff's voice was tinged with a hint of sincere concern, while the voice of the sword wraith was full of biting mockery. Sunny was motionless for a few moments, still holding Nephi's by her hand. He shivered slightly after his second attempt to use Shadow Step failed, and she must have felt it. He looked up at her and hesitated. When he spoke, his voice sounded hollow. "My ability doesn't seem to work anymore." An insidious fear suddenly drowned his heart, and at the same time, the dark island quaked again. The source of the tremor much closer than it had been before. The fear was irrational and animalistic. It had little to do with their perilous situation, and more with that fact that his powers had abandoned him without a warning. It was as though he had suddenly found himself missing a limb. There was disbelief, confusion, dread. And, finally, terror. It took all his willpower to push the terror down. The sin of Solace laughed. Ignoring it, Sunny forced himself to speak. Just give me a moment." He had no idea why Shadow Step, which had never failed him before, was suddenly ineffective. Perhaps something was wrong with the shadows populating the insides of the black turtle. If so, there was an easy way to check. A few moments later, the shadow lantern appeared in his hand, and a flood of shadows flowed out of its open gate. However, the result was the same. It was not the shadows that were wrong, but Sunny himself. Really? Such an idiot. The damned sword wraith was having the time of his life. Sunny clenched his fists, then uttered through gritted teeth, "I don't seem to be able to bring us away, at the moment." Sorry. Nephi's frowned, then carefully looked around. After a short pause, she suddenly said, in hindsight, "It makes sense." Feeling a sudden sense of hope, he raised an eyebrow. "It does." She nodded. "It is a great monster, after all, and we are inside its body. A creature like that would have protections against someone like you bypassing its fearsome armor by teleporting directly inside. The black turtle is dead, but some of its defenses must still remain. Perhaps if the gap in power between us wasn't so vast, your ability could have still tore through them." Sunny remained silent for a few moments. "Why didn't I think about that before?" Nephi shook her head. "I didn't, either. Don't you think that blaming yourself is too much? We couldn't have known. We've never faced an enemy such as this." She was right, but she was also wrong. Sunny might not have tried to enter the body of a colossal enemy through Shadow Step before, but he saw how the Azure Serpent had killed the black turtle. He could have at least considered the possibility of doing something similar. In any case, everything seemed simple in hindsight. He winced, then looked at Nephi's silently. As if reading his thoughts, she guided her flames from the blade of the incandescent dagger, through her body, and into his. But the result was the same. Shadow Step was refusing to activate. After feeling the warmth of Neph's flame leaving him, Sunny drew in a shaky breath and belatedly realized that he was still holding her hand. He was in no hurry to let go, finding it reassuring. A deep frown appeared on Sunny's face as he looked in the direction of the entrance of the tunnel. Right now, the Azure Serpent and the great monster it was fighting were exceedingly close to the gaping wound, making the prospect of leaving the way they had come absolutely lethal. What were their options, though? Staying here was tantamount to death, as well. Actually, there is a third option. Sunny turned around and looked into the depths of the tunnel, then pulled Nephi's forward. Let's go. The entrance is blocked, but there's still the exit. The old snake burrowed right through, didn't it? The exit wound is on the other side of the turtle's body, under its flipper. We'll escape through there and climb back onto the island. That was the most rational decision he could make. The two of them hesitated for a moment, and then dove back into the seething water. Shortening the length of the golden rope to keep them closer to each other, Sunny and Nephi swam through the diluted blood of the slain behemoth. Even though fighting against the current was incredibly hard, they moved further away from the harrowing battle with each stroke. Hurry! Hurry! Sunny felt a dire urgency and pushed himself forward with as much strength as he could muster. The tunnel was not that long. The entity body of the black turtle spanned less than 2 kilometers, and the bloody path the Azure Serpent had burrowed through had to be half that. Of course, it was twisting and turning, and the chaotic movement of the water made it difficult to advance. But still, they were going to reach the exit soon. As they swam, they witnessed more signs of the destruction that the great river beast had wreaked, both when killing the black turtle and while feeding on its flesh later on. The walls of the tunnel sometimes expanded into vast caverns where the turtle's organs had been, now torn to pieces and completely obliterated. Pieces of bone and tough cartilage protruded from the darkness. Sunny found it all both grotesque and strangely, darkly mesmerizing. I am swimming through a great monster. I feel like it's a dream. Well, it was. A nightmare, to be precise. Just as they passed the middle point of the tunnel and felt the current change, pulling them in the direction of their goal, he suddenly noticed something strange. Out there, a small distance in front of them. It was as though something was softly shining in the darkness. The glow was so faint that Sunny thought that he was mistaken, but the next time his head broke the surface, he saw it again. After hesitating for a moment, he suddenly pulled on the golden rope and pushed his tired body against the current once again, trying to make his way to the source of the strange glow. Nephi's and Sunny climbed onto a frayed piece of cartilage and looked at the wall of the tunnel. Out there, hidden in the folds of torn flesh. He took a deep breath. Was an enormous, radiant crystal that shone with ethereal light. It was one of the 2 supreme soul shards that the death of the black turtle would have left behind. Sunny briefly glanced at Nephi's, then summoned the covetous coffer once more. The shard was too large to fit into the opening of the alloy chest, so he concentrated and changed it, keeping the shape but changing the size. A few moments later, the alloy chest seemed more like an alloy sarcophagus fit for a giant. Or someone like the Shadow Spawn. I can't believe it. We came down to harvest some meat, but ended up with something like that, gods. I can't even imagine how much it would cost in the waking world. Actually, it wouldn't have a cost. These things are so rare that they can't be bought with money. Even though they were pressed for time, he just couldn't let this chance slip through his fingers. Neph. Can you help me? Together, they hacked at the fold of the turtle's flesh to widen the opening, and then used all their strength to lift the massive soul shard and load it into the open maw of the covetous coffer. After that, they had to plunge into the water again. Several torturous minutes later, Sunny and Nephi's used the silver chains at the side of the island to scale the slope of the black turtle's shell, and fell side by side on the rocks in exhaustion. Knowing how Neph would look in her wet tunic, Sunny refused to turn his head and instead stared at the sky. The warm feeling of their arms touching was enough for him. They needed to move. To hide. But he was too tired. Just a few moments. Sunny took a deep breath and tried to calm down a little. Then, he suddenly let out a low chuckle. Ah. But it's funny. After examining the estuary key, he had thought it impossible to collect one, let alone 6 supreme soul shards. The idea itself seemed utterly preposterous. And yet, here he was just a couple of weeks later, in possession of one. It had just fallen into his hands, almost on its own. A strange shiver ran up his spine. It was then that Nephi suddenly raised her hand and whispered, "Look." In the sky above the island, the monstrous butterfly was spreading its black wings once again.